It was exactly 6:15 on a Tuesday morning when my phone lit up. The text was from my son, Julian, whom I had spent decades building a shipping logistics empire to support. Dad, plans changed. You're not boarding the cruise next week. Patty wants only her family there. I didn't yell. Instead, I looked out at the rainy Seattle docks and decided to systematically dismantle their lives before they could board the ship. My name is Eugene Barrett. I'm 71 years old, and for 40 years, I ran the largest shipyard repair business in Seattle. Managing dock workers and shipping budgets taught me that anger is useless. When a hull breaches, you don't scream. You patch the rot and hold the responsible party accountable. The cruise was a 10-day Alaskan voyage costing $45,000, paid in full on my credit card. I booked the owner's suite, the crown jewel of the ship, complete with a private balcony, butler service, and panoramic views. It was a tribute to my late wife, Diane. Alaska was her dream, but I was always too busy. After she died, I promised to take Julian and Patricia there for her birthday. Instead, my son uninvited me for my own $45,000 gift because his wife wanted her parents there. I dialed Julian's number. The phone rang twice, and then the line went dead. He rejected my call. My own son, the boy whose college tuition I paid in cash, was too much of a coward to speak to me. He had always been spineless, trading his mother's practical values for Patricia's manipulative control. I waited 30 seconds and dialed again. This time, someone else picked up. "Hello, Eugene," Patricia's voice came through. It was dripping with that artificial, sweet politeness she always used right before she did something toxic. "Put Julian on the phone, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Julian is in the shower, Eugene," she said smoothly. "And really, there's nothing to discuss." The text was clear. The plans have changed. "That is a $45,000 trip," I replied. "I booked the owner's suite to celebrate Diane's birthday. You don't just change the passengers and uninvite the person paying the bill." I heard her sigh dramatically. "Look, Eugene," she whispered, her voice hardening. "My parents, Charles and Brenda, have never been on a luxury vacation. They deserve this experience. And my brother Donald is coming along too to help. Let's be honest, older people like you get seasick so easily. It's a huge liability. You just get tired and complain the whole time. My parents are in much better shape to enjoy the owner's suite." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She was hijacking my deeply personal tribute to my late wife to use as a free luxury vacation for her parents and her deadbeat brother, Donald, a 32-year-old man who had dropped out of 2 colleges and lived in his parents' basement. I stayed completely silent, letting her words hang in the air. Patricia took my silence as submission. "We'll make sure to bring you back some nice souvenirs, Eugene," she added with fake pity. "Just stay home and enjoy the quiet. We'll see you when we get back." The line went dead. I walked into my study, opened my laptop, and logged into the cruise portal. I pasted the booking confirmation number and pulled up the passenger manifest. My name was completely gone. In the space where Eugene Barrett should have been was the name Charles Garrison. Below him was Brenda Garrison, then Julian Barrett, Patricia Garrison, and Donald Garrison. They hadn't just uninvited me. They had actively logged into my account, deleted my name, and replaced me with the entire Garrison family. And as I scrolled down, I saw that they had linked Donald's premium beverage package directly to my credit card, which was still saved in the system as the default payment method for all onboard charges. They expected me to pay for their drinks while they sailed on my stolen gift. Exactly 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was Julian. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Dad, are you there?" Julian's voice was shaky, thin and filled with anxiety. "I'm here, Julian," I said. "Look, I'm really sorry about how this came out," he stammered. "Patty didn't mean to sound harsh. The truth is, we're dealing with a very complicated medical situation. Patty has been struggling with severe clinical depression for the last few months. Her therapist strongly suggested that she needs a stress-free, supportive environment with her immediate family to heal. Her parents and Donald know exactly how to handle her triggers." It was a meticulously crafted lie. Just 3 days ago, I had seen Patricia celebrating with her friends at an expensive downtown Seattle restaurant, drinking cocktails and laughing loudly. There was no clinical depression. It's just for her health, Dad, Julian pleaded. We didn't want to burden you, and we fully intend to pay you back for your ticket eventually. Once our finances stabilize, we will set up a monthly payment plan. Please don't ruin this healing journey by getting angry. I knew I would never see a single dollar. They lived in a $2 million Bellevue mansion that I had bought for them in cash, yet they were drowning in credit card debt, trying to maintain an elite social media image. But I didn't call him out. I leaned directly into the lie. All right, son, I said softly, mimicking a defeated, understanding old father. If Patricia is struggling, then she needs her family. I completely understand. Don't worry about me. Focus on her health. We can discuss the reimbursement plans when you get back. Really, Dad? Julian's voice overflowed with relief and arrogance. You're not mad? Thank you. This means the world to us. I have to go help Patty finish packing, but I'll text you before we board. Have a safe journey, son, I said and hung up. They thought they had won. They thought their clueless old father was safely out of the way. But they were catastrophically wrong. The real war had just begun. As I sat in the quiet study, my phone buzzed again. It was a secure push notification from my bank. An automated security alert was flagging my joint emergency checking account. An account I shared with Julian but hadn't touched in years. I unlocked the screen and opened the app. The available balance had been drastically reduced. I scrolled to the recent activity there. Glowing in stark digital print were 3 back-to-back cash withdrawals, each executed just minutes apart. The amount of each withdrawal was exactly $9,800, pulling a total of $29,400 out of the account. My blood turned to ice. In the U.S. banking system, any cash withdrawal of $10, 0 or more triggers a mandatory report to the federal government. By keeping each transaction at exactly $9,800, whoever took the money was actively committing a federal crime known as structuring. They were trying to drain my cash without triggering any alarms. They weren't just stealing a vacation. They were draining my bank accounts to finance something dark, and they were using my own money to do it. I stood in my quiet study, staring at the banking ledger on my phone. The 3 cash withdrawals of $9,800 were not a mistake. They were a deliberate evasion of federal reporting systems, executed by my own son. Why would Julian, a man earning a decent salary at my former shipping firm, suddenly need nearly $30,000 in raw, untraceable cash right before boarding a luxury cruise? He was a manager at the company's Seattle Marine Terminal, earning a salary of $120,000 a year, a position I had secured for him to ensure he learned the shipping trade from the ground up. He had no major debts, no mortgages on their Bellevue house, and no medical bills. His credit cards were clear, and his checking account was stable. The only explanation was a shadow transaction, a dark trade that needed to remain hidden from my lawyers and the bank's automated compliance systems. You don't need cash on a modern cruise ship. Every charge is linked directly to your digital cabin card. Cash is only used when you need to pay for things under the table, things that can never leave a digital paper trail. I grabbed my heavy wool coat and walked out into the gray Seattle morning. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The drive across the floating bridge to the affluent suburb of Bellevue usually took 30 minutes, but today the road felt like an eternity. As I drove, my mind cycled through my decades of managing cargo logistics. I knew that when a shipping container is leaking, you don't just stare at the manifest. You drive to the shipyard, inspect the cargo, and find the rot yourself. I approached the cul-de-sac where Julian and Patricia lived. I didn't park in their wide paved driveway. I parked 2 blocks away, out of sight of their front door smart camera, and walked the remaining distance. The house at the end of the street was a modern $2.2 million architectural estate. I knew the value because I had paid for the entire property in cash. Julian and Patricia had complained about rising mortgage rates when they got married, so I wanted to give my only son a solid foundation. But my business instincts had prevailed. I legally placed the house into a strict revocable living trust. I retained the deed, paid the property taxes, and let them live there rent-free. They had complete financial freedom, and they were using it to systematically rob me. I slipped through the side gate, avoiding the front entrance. I walked to the side door of the garage, pulled out my master key, and quietly turned the deadbolt. The lock clicked open with barely a sound. I stepped into the dim, spacious three-car garage. Julian's sports car and Patricia's luxury SUV sat under the overhead lights, both purchased with cash gifts I had given them. From the ceiling above, I could hear muffled sounds. There were footsteps, the thud of heavy suitcases being dragged, and laughter. They were celebrating. I made my way to the narrow utility stairs that led directly up to the hallway near the master suite. Placing my boots on the very edge of each wooden step to avoid any squeaks, I ascended. Through the cracked door of the master bedroom, the morning light spilled into the hallway. I stood in the shadows, my back pressed against the wall, and listened. The Garrison family had always been a source of tension in my house. Charles and Brenda Garrison were high society strivers, people who had spent their entire lives living beyond their means, leasing luxury cars and buying designer labels just to look like they belonged in Bellevue. Patricia had inherited their vanity. When she married Julian, she immediately set out to change him, pushing him to demand a larger share of my shipping business and a higher salary. I had watched this parasitic rot grow for 5 years, hoping Julian would eventually find his backbone. Instead, he had allowed them to completely consume him, turning a hard-working shipyard manager into a spineless accomplice to their greed. Patricia's voice was loud and arrogant. She was laughing, telling Donald how easy it had been to handle the old man. Donald, lounging on the bed, chimed in, saying he couldn't wait to get on the ship and order the most expensive vintage whiskey on my credit card. He joked about drinking enough top-shelf liquor to put me in a financial grave. I listened to them salivating over my money. I thought of the cold, freezing rain of the shipyard docks in the 1980s, where I spent 14-hour days loading steel containers just to make sure Julian would never know financial struggle. I sacrificed my own health to build an empire for him, and here he was, standing silently in the bedroom while his wife and brother-in-law mocked me. But what came next shifted this betrayal into something far darker. The laughter stopped, and Julian's voice came through, tight and nervous. "Are you sure about the legal papers, Patty? Doing this while we are out in the middle of the ocean feels like a massive risk. He isn't actually losing his memory. We both know he just misses Mom." My breathing stopped. I pressed closer to the doorframe. "Do you want to wait until your senile father decides to change his mind?" Patricia snapped, her voice cutting like a razor. "He holds all the legal power over the trust. If we don't act, he could leave the entire shipping estate to a maritime charity out of spite." "The paperwork is ready, Julian. My parents' personal doctor has already signed the preliminary medical evaluation. It officially states that Eugene is showing severe cognitive decline and advanced Alzheimer's." A cold sweat broke out across my back. Alzheimer's. It was a fabricated diagnosis. My mind was perfectly sharp. I still managed my own investment portfolios. "The court will demand a second opinion," Julian stammered, sounding terrified. "You know my dad. He won't just sit there if he gets backed into a corner. He won't have a choice." Patricia scoffed. "That's why we're leaving on the cruise tomorrow. While we are in international waters, completely unreachable, our lawyer, Silas Thorne, will file the emergency petition for guardianship. The judge will see a signed medical affidavit from a licensed physician, and they will grant temporary guardianship immediately." She paused, and I heard her pacing. "When the court asks for erratic behavior, we will present his sudden decision to cancel his own expensive cruise tickets at the last minute as proof of severe cognitive deterioration. By the time we dock back in Seattle next week, the emergency court order will be processed. We will have a medical transport team waiting at his front door. He will be transitioned into a locked memory care facility, and we will assume total legal control over the revocable trust, the Bellevue estate, and all his bank accounts. The trap was perfect. They had used my grief over Diane's death to paint me as an unstable recluse. My decision to let them have the cruise was the final piece of evidence they needed to lock me away and steal my life. The 3 cash withdrawals of $9,800 were the bribes paid to the corrupt doctor and their lawyer to bypass federal reporting. I didn't feel any sadness. The last trace of parental warmth died right there in that dark hallway. Julian wasn't my son anymore. He was a hostile threat to my survival. I turned and slipped back down the utility stairs, stepping quietly out of the garage. I walked back to my truck, my mind working with cold, mechanical precision. They had declared war, and I was going to deliver a financial demolition so devastating they would never recover. I drove directly into the heart of downtown Seattle, pulling into the garage of a glass high-rise. 10 minutes later, I walked through the doors of Cole and Associates. Gideon Cole, my personal attorney and closest friend for 35 years, was waiting. He looked at my face, stood up from his desk, and shut the door. "Who are we destroying today, Eugene?" he asked. "My son," I replied. Gideon Cole sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face growing darker with every word I spoke. We had been friends for 35 years, and he had handled every legal detail of my shipping empire, protecting my assets from cargo claims, dock worker union battles, and hostile corporate takeovers. We had stood side by side through the toughest financial storms of the 1990s, and we trusted each other completely. He knew my late wife, Diane, and he knew how hard we had worked to build our legacy. To see Julian, whom Gideon had watched grow from a young boy, plot to declare me incompetent was a personal insult to everything we had built. He was a legal shark, but what I was telling him made him look genuinely sick. I explained the text message, the cruise booking, the structured cash withdrawals of $29,400 from our joint account, and the conversation I had heard through the cracked bedroom door in Bellevue. When I mentioned the fake Alzheimer's diagnosis and the plan to file for emergency guardianship next Tuesday, Gideon let out a low growl. "They are weaponizing the probate court, Eugene," Gideon said, his fingers already typing rapidly on his computer. As a senior partner in a major Pacific Northwest firm, Gideon had back-end access to the County Superior Court's digital staging queue. Attorneys staged draft petitions there before officially submitting them to a judge. "Look at this," Gideon said, swiveling his monitor to face me. There it was, a draft petition titled, "In re the guardianship of Eugene Barrett, an incapacitated person." The petitioner was Julian Barrett, represented by Silas Thorne, the Garrison family's private lawyer. Attached as an exhibit was a preliminary medical affidavit signed by Dr. Ronald Gable, stating, "I was in the advanced stages of cognitive decline." The scheduled filing date was next Tuesday at 9 a.m., exactly 4 hours after Julian's cruise ship was scheduled to set sail from Seattle. "It's a clean execution," Gideon muttered, his legal mind analyzing the blueprint of their attack. "While they are in international waters unreachable, Thorne files this. The judge sees a signed medical affidavit and grants a temporary emergency order. By the time they return in 10 days, they have full control of your trust. They can legally lock you in a facility, and you won't even have a phone to call me." "Can we stop it?" I asked, my voice calm. "Easily," Gideon said. "We file a preemptive counter-injunction, alert the probate judge to the fraudulent doctor, and sue Julian for elder financial abuse under Washington law, specifically RCW 7434. We'll tie them up in litigation for years. I will make sure Silas Thorne and that doctor lose their licenses. We will drag them through a legal hell they will never escape." "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's too slow. In litigation, they get to hire lawyers, file extensions, and sleep in the Bellevue house while we fight. I don't want a long courtroom battle. I want a total, instantaneous liquidation. When they return from that cruise, I want their entire world to have vanished from the ledger." Gideon leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "What are you thinking, Eugene?" I had spent my entire career in the marine shipping industry, where time is the most expensive variable on the ledger. When a vessel is damaged or taking on water in a storm, you don't call a committee to debate the repair schedule. You make immediate, decisive cuts to save the cargo. If you hesitate, the pressure of the sea will crush the hull and drag everything down to the ocean floor. Julian and Patricia believed they had a 10-day window to execute their legal coup, assuming I would remain passive and blind. I was going to use those 10 days to completely dismantle their foundation, leaving them with absolutely nothing to return to. "I want to sell the Bellevue mansion," I stated flatly. "Not next month. I want it sold and recorded before they even reach international waters." Gideon blinked. "A traditional real estate sale takes 30 to 60 days, Eugene." Even with cash buyers, you have title searches, escrow, and inspections. They'll be back long before a deal closes. We're not doing a traditional sale, I replied, leaning forward. We're doing a corporate liquidation called Dante Rossi. Dante Rossi ran the largest cash-flipping real estate syndicate on the West Coast. He bought distressed commercial and residential properties sight unseen, using massive pools of institutional capital to close transactions in a matter of days. He and I had done business 10 years ago when I liquidated my company's old shipping warehouses. Dante didn't care about emotional value. He only cared about margins and speed. Gideon reached for his desk phone, dialed Dante's private line, and put it on speaker. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Cole," Dante boomed. "I'm in the middle of a commercial acquisition. What do you have for me?" "Dante, it's Eugene Barrett," I said. There was a brief pause, then a warm laugh. "Gene, I thought you were retired. What does the shipping kingpin want with a cash buyer on a rainy Thursday?" "I have a prime residential asset in Bellevue," I said, my voice cutting through the casual tone. "Cul-de-sac lot, modern design, clean title, zero mortgages. The current market appraisal is exactly $2.2 million. I'll sell it to you for a flat 20% discount, $1.76 million cash." I heard Dante's breathing change. A Bellevue property with a 20% margin was an incredibly lucrative deal. "What's the catch, Gene?" "Two non-negotiable conditions," I said. "First, the transaction must close, and the deed must be recorded in exactly 3 days. I want the wire transfer cleared in Gideon's escrow account by Monday at 9 a.m. No inspections, no title delays." "I can do that," Dante said quickly. "My legal team can run a title check in 2 hours. What's the second condition?" "The sale is strictly as is," I replied, my voice dropping. "And when I say as is, I mean the physical contents of the house. I want your crews at the house next Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. I want you to treat everything inside, the furniture, the clothing, the televisions, the personal effects, as abandoned property. You keep what you want to sell, and you throw the rest into a commercial dumpster. I want the locks changed, the windows boarded, and the house gutted to the studs by the time they get back." Silence fell over the speakerphone. Even a hardened flipper like Dante was quiet for a few seconds, processing the sheer coldness of the move. But a $440,000 profit margin on a Bellevue property was too massive to refuse. "You're a brutal man, Gene," Dante said, a dark chuckle coming through the line. "But I like speed. Send the title documents to my team. We will have the purchase agreement drafted by tonight. We will close Monday morning." "Thank you, Dante," I said, and ended the call. I looked at Gideon, who was staring at me with a mix of shock and profound respect. The structural demolition of my son's lifestyle had officially begun. I had just traded their Bellevue sanctuary for $1.76 million in liquid cash, and Julian had absolutely no idea he was about to become homeless. With the Bellevue house contract scheduled to close on Monday morning, I turned my attention to the crews. Simply selling their home and taking my cash back wasn't enough. I wanted them to experience the exact same feeling of being completely trapped and helpless that they had planned to inflict on me. I wanted them isolated, miles out at sea, before they realized their financial life support had been cut off. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and called the VIP customer service line for Royal Caribbean. Because of my high loyalty status from decades of corporate shipping travel, a representative answered within 3 rings. "Welcome back, Mr. Barrett," she said warmly. "How can I assist you with your upcoming departure for the owner's suite?" "I need to make an administrative change to the booking," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. I provided my verification details, billing zip code, and the booking reference number. "A sudden business emergency has come up. I will not be boarding the vessel tomorrow morning." "Oh, I am so sorry to hear that, sir," she replied, her tone shifting to practice sympathy. "Would you like me to cancel the reservation and issue a refund according to your platinum benefits?" "No," I said. "Do not cancel the booking. The other passengers on the folio, Julian Barrett, Patricia Barrett, and Donald Garrison, will still be boarding as scheduled. Keep their boarding passes active." "Certainly," she said, typing on her keyboard. "I can adjust the manifest so they can check in without you. Is there anything else?" Yes, I said. I want my credit card permanently removed from the booking, sever all financial responsibility for their cabin, remove my card from their individual onboard accounts, their digital key cards, and any room services. The representative paused. Mr. Barrett, if I remove your card, all prepaid packages currently linked to it will be canceled. That includes the premium beverage package for Donald Garrison, the high-speed satellite internet packages, and the specialty dining reservations. They will have to provide a new credit card at the terminal check-in to reactivate those services. I understand, I said. That is my exact intention. They are fully responsible for their own expenses from this moment on. Understood, sir. I have updated the portal. The account now reflects a zero balance, and all linked amenities have been removed. A credit card will be required at check-in. I knew exactly how Donald Garrison would react. Patricia's brother was a 30-year-old unemployed leech who spent his days playing video games, drinking expensive scotch, and charging everything to his parents' credit cards. He had been bragging to his friends for weeks about the unlimited VIP access he would have on this cruise, promising them premium liquors and luxury specialty dinners on my account. By removing my platinum card, I was not only cutting off Julian's financial support, but I was also setting up Donald for a massive, humiliating shock at the guest services desk. He would be forced to face the reality of his own empty pockets in front of the entire ship's crew. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my truck, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. They were going to board a luxury liner, thinking they had unlimited access to my wealth, only to find themselves completely cut off before the ship even left the harbor. The next morning, Tuesday, arrived with a brisk, damp wind that carried the heavy smell of coal smoke and sea salt from the Seattle harbor. The sky was a pale, wet gray, a classic Pacific Northwest morning that felt like a shipyard day. By 8 a.m., I was parked in an elevated viewing lot overlooking the port of Seattle's Terminal 91. Through my truck's windshield, I could see the massive white hull of the luxury cruise liner docked at the pier, preparing to cast off for Alaska. At exactly 8:30 a.m., a premium black rideshare SUV pulled up to the VIP drop-off lane. I raised my binoculars. Julian stepped out first, looking relaxed in expensive resort clothing. Patricia followed, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and gesturing dramatically as the driver unloaded their massive array of luggage. Then Donald bounced out, wearing a loud tropical shirt. They were laughing, talking loudly, completely enveloped in their own arrogance. They handed their suitcases to the porters and walked through the terminal doors. I pulled up Patricia's public social media profile on my tablet. She had just posted a selfie of the three of them in front of the ship. The caption read, "Embarking on our hard-earned luxury vacation, time to leave all the stress behind and completely pamper ourselves." I watched the ship for another 2 hours. The loading ramps were pulled back, the thick mooring lines were detached, and the ship's massive engines rumbled to life, vibrating the windows of my truck. The horn blew a long, deafening blast that echoed across the waterfront. The colossal white vessel slowly slid away from the pier, turning its bow toward the open waters of Puget Sound. In a few hours, they would lose all cellular connection. They would be entirely dependent on the ship's satellite internet, a service that now cost $100 per day per device, and which they had no money to pay for. They were trapped on a floating metal island in the middle of the ocean, completely cut off from their lawyer and their Bellevue reality. I put my truck in gear and drove back downtown. Gideon was waiting in his office, along with Dante Rossi and 2 corporate lawyers. The closing was brief and professional. Dante's legal team had verified that the title was clean, the trust was revoked, and I was the sole owner. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final deed transfer. I sat at my mahogany desk later, staring at a framed photograph of Diane. She was a practical, strong-willed woman who had always taught Julian to stand on his own 2 feet and take responsibility for his actions. She would have been utterly devastated to see the spineless, greedy man he had become, plotting to lock his own father in a memory care facility so just to accelerate his inheritance. But there was no room for grief or sentimentality now. In shipping, when a cargo vessel is structurally compromised and sinking, you don't waste time mourning the voyage. You cut the anchor, clear the decks, and salvage the assets. That was exactly what I was doing. 3 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was a secure alert from my bank. Incoming wire transfer of $1,760,000 cleared and settled. The Bellevue house was officially gone. The cash was locked in my private account, completely out of Julian's reach. I stood up and shook Dante's hand. "Your crews are clear to enter tomorrow morning?" I asked. "Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, Gene." Dante grinned. "My trucks are already staged. We're going to gut the place." I walked out of the high-rise into the Seattle rain. I had the cash, the house was sold, and my ungrateful son was floating toward Alaska on a ship where he couldn't even buy a cup of coffee. The cargo was loaded, the locks were sealed, and the storm was about to hit them. The luxury cruise industry operates on a completely cashless model. Once a passenger boards, cash is useless. Every transaction is processed through a digital cabin card. That card must be backed by a valid active credit card. By removing my platinum card from their booking, I had severed their financial oxygen. I knew it would take a few hours for the ship to reach international waters and for the billing system to update. Right on schedule, as I sat in the quiet of my home, the first wave of messages came. Because they were out of cell tower range, they had to rely on the ship's emergency satellite network. The audio files left on my voicemail were crackled with static. But the panic in their voices was crystal clear. I played the first voicemail. It was Julian, his voice shaky and breathless. He explained that a highly embarrassing situation had just occurred in the ship's main lounge. Patricia, flanked by her parents and Donald, had marched to the premium bar and ordered a $500 bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate their arrival. When she handed the bartender her cabin card, the machine beeped. Declined, Patricia had erupted, demanding the bartender run it again, claiming there was a mistake and that the account had an unlimited credit line. The bartender tried twice more, but the machine refused. The lounge manager was called, who explained in front of a dozen wealthy passengers that the primary cardholder had revoked the payment authorization. Julian begged me to call the cruise line immediately and fix what he assumed was a bank error. He said Charles and Brenda were deeply embarrassed. By the scene, I deleted the message and played the second one, recorded 40 minutes later. The confusion in Julian's voice had turned to pure, raw panic. He had gone to the guest services desk to buy a satellite internet package to check his accounts. The service cost $100 per day. When he handed the purser the debit card for our joint emergency checking account, the one they had used to structure the cash withdrawals, the purser told him it was declined for insufficient funds. Julian was frantic. He screamed into the voicemail, asking how an account with over $400,000 in liquid cash could possibly show a zero balance. He begged me to answer, to contact the bank and report a massive fraud. This joint account was a deeply sentimental asset. My late wife Diane had insisted we set it up when Julian first left for the University of Washington. She wanted him to have an ironclad safety net in case of a real crisis, a medical emergency, a broken-down car, or a sudden housing loss. I had argued that a young man needed to face hardships to build character, but Diane had looked at me with those compromising eyes and demanded we establish it. I deposited the capital and let it sit. Julian knew the rules. It was a sacred arrangement, meant only for life or death situations. By using it to structure cash withdrawals, to bribe a corrupt doctor, he hadn't just stolen from me. He had completely desecrated his mother's memory. Diane had always believed that a family was a team, a single vessel navigating the sea together. She had hoped that the joint account would act as a bridge of trust between Julian and me, a way for him to feel secure while he built his own career. She had trusted him completely, and she had spent her final days telling me to watch over him. To see Julian treat that trust as an opportunity for theft, using the very account his mother created to fund a legal assault on my life, was a complete betrayal of her legacy. He had turned her gift of love into a weapon of greed, and I was going to make sure that weapon backfired on him completely. He had no idea that the moment my bank alerted me to their structured withdrawals, I had legally transferred the remaining $370,600 of my money into a secure solo account. The joint account was a hollow shell. They had taken their $29,400 to bribe the doctor, But they had left themselves with absolutely nothing. I looked at the banking app on my own screen, seeing the transaction logs. On Monday at 9:15 a.m., 3 withdrawals of $9,800 had been debited. At 9:30 a.m., my transfer of $370,600 had cleared. They had structured their theft perfectly, but they didn't realize that in my business, if you breach the hull of a vessel, the cargo gets salvaged immediately. The third voicemail was from Patricia. The arrogant, sweet politeness was gone, replaced by hysterical sobbing. She was screaming in the background, blaming Julian for not verifying the credit lines before they boarded. She wailed that her parents were turning against her because the primary booking details had been altered and my credit card removed. The cruise line had downgraded their reservations. Instead of the owner's suite, Charles and Brenda had been moved to a tiny, windowless interior cabin on the lowest deck. They were furious, accusing Patricia and Julian of being swindlers who had dragged them onto a cheap trip under false pretenses. Patricia cried that they had been barred from the specialty restaurants. Without a valid credit card on file, they were restricted to the crowded complimentary buffet line. Her brother, Donald, was throwing a tantrum in the corridor because his premium drink package was canceled. He had tried to buy a beer with his own card, but it was declined too. He was stuck on a 10-day cruise without a single drop of top-shelf alcohol, and they had zero funds. "Eugene, please," Patricia sobbed. "You have to fix this. My parents are miserable. They won't even look at me. Just put your card back on the account. We'll pay you back every cent, I swear." I deleted her message. I imagined them standing in the long, crowded buffet lines, rubbing shoulders with the economy passengers they looked down on, holding cheap plastic plates of pasta. I pictured Donald shivering on the deck, sober and furious. I pictured Julian staring at his phone, realizing the bank account was dry. In maritime shipping, when a crew attempts a mutiny, they expect to take over the bridge and steer the ship. They never consider that the owner can cut off the fuel supply from the shore. Julian and Patricia thought they were sailing into a luxurious new life of leisure. Instead, they had boarded a floating prison of their own making. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, letting the warm liquid settle in my chest. The temperature outside the cabin was dropping rapidly, the wind howling through the fir trees, but inside my private study, the air felt exceptionally warm, quiet, and peaceful. I looked out the window at the dark waters of the Sound, imagining the cruise ship pushing through the waves, its passengers completely oblivious to the financial storm that was about to break over their heads. Let them eat from the free buffet. Let them spend the next 10 days trapped in international waters, slowly descending into financial madness. Their dream vacation had officially become a nightmare, and the demolition crew hadn't even entered the Bellevue house yet. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., Dante Rossi's trucks would arrive. I looked at the photograph of Diane one last time before turning off the desk lamp. I had secured the cash, cut the lines, and now the structural collapse of their lives was about to accelerate on dry land. At exactly 7:45 on Tuesday morning, I sat in my parked truck across the street from the Bellevue estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of morning rain. I had a warm paper cup of black coffee in my hands. The cul-de-sac was silent, the manicured lawns pristine, completely oblivious to the absolute demolition that was about to occur. This house was a modern architectural masterpiece, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a cedar facade, and a custom steel framework. I had overseen the site preparation myself, ensuring the foundation was poured on solid glacial till. I paid $2.2 million in cash for it, hoping it would be a place where Julian could build a stable, honest life. Instead, Patricia had filled it with superficial vanity, transforming a clean structural design into a monument of unearned wealth. Right on time, the heavy roar of diesel engines broke the quiet. Two massive roll-off dumpsters were backed down the stamped concrete driveway. The heavy steel wheels ground into the turf, tearing deep tracks into the expensive sod. Patricia had demanded I finance just last spring. Behind the dumpsters, 3 large box trucks pulled up to the curb. A crew of 12 burly men in work boots stepped out. Dante Rossi had kept his word. These were property extraction specialists, guys who liquidated foreclosed commercial warehouses and seized assets for corporate banks. They worked with a mechanical efficiency that was chilling. The foreman, holding a clipboard and a heavy steel crowbar, marched up to the custom front door. He didn't try to pick the electronic smart lock that Patricia had programmed with her personal security codes. He simply jammed the crowbar into the frame and wrenched it back. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door swung open. Dante's extraction crew was led by a big, silent foreman named Marcus, a man who had cleared out dozens of foreclosed mansions and seized commercial warehouses for banks. He had seen it all. People crying, people screaming, people pleading for their things. He worked with a cold, businesslike efficiency that I respected. He didn't care about the emotional history of the velvet sofas or the designer suits. He only cared about the number of dumpsters he could fill in. A single day, he looked at the Bellevue house and saw nothing but a cargo load that needed to be liquidated and cleared from the manifest. The crew moved in like an army of locusts. Within minutes, the front doors were wedged open, and the physical eradication of my son's unearned life began. 2 workers came out of the entrance, carrying the custom-ordered white velvet sofas Patricia had purchased. I remembered the invoice clearly. She had handed the interior designer my platinum card, racking up $18,000 for a single room, claiming the Bellevue estate needed to reflect her social standing. The workers dragged the sofas across the rough concrete porch without lifting them. They hoisted the heavy frames over the side of the dumpster and let them drop. The white velvet tore against the rusted steel, completely ruined in seconds. Then came the clothing. Workers in the master bedroom began throwing black plastic garbage bags directly out of the second-story window into the dumpster below. The bags split open on impact, spilling Patricia's designer wardrobe. Hundreds of silk dresses, premium leather bags, and imported shoes fell into the metal bin like common garbage. She had spent weeks planning her luxury cruise outfits, unaware that her entire material existence was being hauled to a municipal landfill. Julian's possessions followed. A worker emerged from the garage carrying 2 premium leather golf bags filled with custom-fitted titanium clubs. Julian had insisted he needed the professional clubs to network with shipping executives at private country clubs. The worker swung the bags by their straps, launching them into the dumpster. The sound of snapping carbon fiber shafts and bending titanium echoed down the quiet street. Next, they cleared the kitchen. I watched them carry out Patricia's expensive imported espresso machine, the designer copper pots that had never been used to cook a real meal, and case after case of expensive wine they had bought on my credit card. The workers didn't pack them in bubble wrap. They tossed them directly into the dumpsters. The crash of breaking glass and twisted metal filled the quiet Bellevue air. The noise quickly drew attention. Mrs. Abernathy, the president of the local homeowners association, came running down the sidewalk, her face red with anger. She was a snobbish woman who had always looked down on my blue-collar background, wrinkling her nose at my shipyard work boots whenever she saw me at Thanksgiving. "What is going on here?" she screamed at the foreman. "You can't park those dumpsters in the driveway. This is a private community. I am calling Patricia right now." The foreman didn't flinch. He reached into his vest, pulled out a laminated copy of the deed transfer recorded the day before, and handed it to her. "We are authorized by Cole & Associates representing the legal owner, Dante Rossi Acquisitions. The property was sold as is, and the prior occupants have been evicted. We are clearing abandoned contents. If you call the police, they will verify the deed." Mrs. Abernathy stared at the laminated deed transfer document, her eyes scanning the official county seal and the signature of the recording officer. Her face turned from a bright, angry red to a pale, shocked white. She had spent years organizing high society fundraisers and neighborhood block parties, always ensuring that Bellevue's elite families were presented with absolute perfection. To see a prominent home in her cul-de-sac, boarded up, chained, and gutted like a common foreclosed warehouse, was a massive scandal that would ruin the neighborhood's prestige. She looked at the dumpster, then at the empty, dark front door, realizing the absolute finality of the situation. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her house. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, permanent peace settle in my chest. By noon, the crew had stripped the house bare. Every television, custom rug, piece of modern art, and appliance had been cleared out. The large bay windows, previously decorated with expensive silk curtains, now revealed empty, hollow rooms. A utility van arrived, and workers began boarding up the ground floor windows with thick sheets of plywood, securing them with steel chains and heavy padlocks. The broken smart locks were stripped away, replaced by commercial-grade deadbolts. If Julian and Patricia somehow returned to Bellevue, they would find their codes deleted, their keys useless, and their house empty. The home they had treated as their birthright was now a locked corporate asset. The hydraulic lift trucks loaded the dumpsters, their diesel engines roaring as they hauled the shattered remnants of my son's lifestyle away. The street returned to its quiet suburban state. I started my truck, crushed the empty coffee cup, and drove away. The land was cleared, the cargo was gone, and my son was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with nothing to his name but a declined cabin card and a windowless interior room. On Wednesday afternoon, I returned to Gideon Cole's office. The wire transfer of $1, $76 million from Dante Rossi, was secure in my private account, but the battle was only half finished. In shipping logistics, securing the vessel is useless if you don't also neutralize the pirates trying to board it. We had cut off their fuel, but we still needed to disable their steering gear. Gideon was waiting for me, surrounded by files. He had spent the morning working with our investigator, Gavin Sanchez, coordinating the evidence. Gavin had done a thorough job tracking the Garrison family. He had gathered bank records, security footage, and witness statements linking Patricia's parents to Dr. Ronald Gable, a corrupt physician who had a history of signing questionable medical affidavits for wealthy Bellevue families. "We have everything we need to dismantle their legal trap," Gideon said, pointing to a stack of documents. "First, I have filed a formal complaint with the Washington State Department of Health against Dr. Ronald Gable. We attached the bank records showing the 3 structured withdrawals of $9, $800 and Gavin's log of Patricia meeting the doctor's assistant at a coffee shop on Monday morning. The DOH will suspend his license by tomorrow morning." "What about Silas Thorne?" I asked. "I have already contacted the County Superior Court's presiding judge and the State Bar Association." Gideon grinned. "We flagged the staging queue. When Thorne attempts to submit that emergency guardianship petition next Tuesday, the court system will trigger a fraud alert. The judge will reject it immediately, and Thorne will face an automatic disciplinary hearing for submitting a fraudulent medical affidavit. He won't just lose the case. He will likely lose his license to practice law." "Good," I said, my voice cold. "I want the lawyers and the doctor who helped them construct this cage to burn along with them." "And finally, we have the civil side," Gideon continued, handing me a copy of a newly drafted complaint. "I am filing a lawsuit against Julian and Patricia for elder financial exploitation under Washington law, specifically RCW 7434-200. We are suing them for the $29, $400 they stole from the joint account, plus treble damages and attorney fees. We are also seeking a permanent civil protection order, which will legally bar them from coming within 500 feet of you or your properties. This lawsuit will immediately place a lien on any other assets they have, freezing their financial movements."
"File it immediately," I said.
But we aren't stopping at a civil lawsuit. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. They committed a federal crime. Gideon nodded, his expression turning serious. "The structuring. 31 U.S.C. 5324 is a serious felony. The federal government does not take kindly to people deliberately evading financial reporting thresholds." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a secure office at the FBI Seattle field office on 2nd Avenue. Seated across from me was Agent Miller, a sharp, no-nonsense federal investigator specializing in financial crimes and elder fraud. The office was quiet, smelling of institutional floor wax and old coffee. I laid the evidence on his desk. I showed him the bank statements, displaying the 3 cash withdrawals of exactly $9,800, pulled minutes apart from the Bellevue branch. I showed him the draft court petition from Silas Thorne and the fraudulent medical affidavit from Dr. Gable. I explained the overheard conversation in the Bellevue mansion, proving the money was structured specifically to bribe a doctor and execute a legal conspiracy. Agent Miller examined the documents, his eyes narrowing as he read the transaction logs. "You're right, Mr. Barrett," he said, tapping the paper. "This is a textbook case of structuring under federal law. People think they are clever by staying under the $10,000 limit, but banks flag consecutive transactions immediately. And when the structured cash is used to facilitate elder exploitation and court fraud, it becomes a priority for us." "My son and his wife are currently in international waters," I said. "They believe they are on a luxury vacation, and they scheduled the court filing to execute while they are unreachable." "They won't be unreachable for long," Agent Miller said, shutting the file. "I am opening a formal investigation today. We will coordinate with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office. By the time their ship docks back in Seattle next week, we will have federal warrants ready. They won't be heading back to their Bellevue home. They will be heading to a federal holding cell." I stood up and shook his hand. "Thank you, Agent Miller." I walked out of the federal building into the cool Seattle air. The trap was now fully constructed, locked, and armed. Julian and Patricia had set out to strip away my freedom and lock me in a memory care facility. Instead, they had structured their own path into a federal prison. Agent Miller had explained that the federal government was actively prioritizing elder financial exploitation cases, especially when they involved structured cash withdrawals designed to bypass bank reporting thresholds. Under federal law, banks are required to file a currency transaction report, CTR, for any cash transaction over $10,000. By withdrawing exactly $9,800 three times in a single morning, Julian had committed a federal felony known as structuring, which carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison and massive financial penalties. The fact that the cash was used to bribe a doctor to forge a psychiatric affidavit only made the case a higher priority for the U.S. Attorney's Office. Miller was already drafting the warrants. I drove to the airport terminal and walked into the VIP lounge. I had booked a first-class ticket to Nice, France. Alaska was Diane's dream, but she had also loved the warmth of the French Riviera. I decided I would charter a private yacht, sail along the Mediterranean, drink a glass of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon, and celebrate her memory in peace, far away from the toxic rot of the Garrison family. Gideon called my phone as I watched the plane's taxi on the wet tarmac. "It's done, Eugene," he said. "The civil lawsuit is officially filed, the DOH is investigating Gable, and the court queue is flagged. Safe travels." "Thanks." "Gideon," I said, "keep Gavin Sanchez on the docks next week. I want to know exactly what happens when they land." "You got it," he said. I hung up the phone, placed it in my leather travel bag, and looked out the large glass windows of the VIP lounge at the rain-soaked tarmac. The jets were taking off into the heavy gray clouds, their engines roaring as they climbed toward the clear sky above. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, feeling the warm liquid settle in my chest. As I walked toward the boarding gate, I felt a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. My shipping empire was sold, my personal wealth was entirely secure, and the heavy legal anchors were slowly dragging my son and his greedy family down to the absolute bottom of the ocean. While my son and his wife were floating toward the freezing glaciers of Alaska, I was on the other side of the world, basking in the warm Mediterranean sun. I chartered a private 60-foot custom sailing yacht named the Sea Falcon in Nice, France, employing a small professional crew to navigate the turquoise waters of the French Riviera. We sailed leisurely between Villefranche-sur-Mer, Monaco, and Saint-Tropez. My skipper, Pierre, was a seasoned French sailor who quickly respected my knowledge of ship hulls and maritime diesel engines. We spent hours talking about sea currents and hull design. Pierre anchored the yacht near a quiet cove in Villefranche-sur-Mer. I went ashore, sat at a small outdoor cafe overlooking the bay, and watched the luxury vessels glide across the water. The locals were polite, the espresso was rich, and the afternoon sun was warm. I read a book about maritime history, letting the hours slip away. It was a stark contrast to Patricia's experience. According to Gavin's reports, when the cruise ship docked in Juneau, Alaska for a brief port visit, Patricia had run off the ship to find a public library with free Wi-Fi just to send an urgent email to Silas Thorne. She spent 2 hours in the rain trying to connect, only to receive an automated reply that Thorne's email server was down for scheduled maintenance, leaving them in absolute silence. The contrast was beautiful. In Alaska, the temperature was hovering near freezing, the skies heavy and gray. On the Mediterranean, the air was warm, the water crystal clear, and the wind steady. I spent my mornings on the deck, drinking fresh espresso, and my evenings sipping vintage wine while watching the sunset over the coast. I kept a framed photograph of Diane on the yacht's mahogany dashboard. I felt a profound sense of peace. For 3 years, I had carried the heavy weight of her loss and the constant anxiety of Julian's failures now. For the first time, I felt light. But I wasn't completely disconnected. Every few days, when we anchored near a coastal town with cellular service, my phone would download updates from Gavin Sanchez, the private investigator I had hired to monitor their situation on the cruise. Gavin had used his maritime industry contacts to plant a discreet observer on the vessel, a security officer who kept a close eye on the Garrison family. The updates from the ship were a source of quiet, satisfying amusement. Because I had removed my credit card, the cruise line had aggressively stripped them of all premium amenities. Julian, Patricia, her parents, and Donald had been relocated from the owner's suite to two small, windowless interior cabins on the lowest deck of the ship. These rooms were located near the engine rooms, meaning they spent their nights listening to the low, rhythmic thumping of the pistons and feeling the vibrations of the ship's propellers. Charles and Brenda Garrison, who had expected a luxurious VIP experience on my dime, were furious. Gavin reported that they spent their days screaming at Patricia in the public lounges. Brenda openly called Julian a useless broke fraud who couldn't even provide a decent vacation for his wife. While Charles sat in silent, toxic anger, Patricia, unable to face her parents' wrath, spent her days hiding in her cabin, crying hysterically. The stress had reached a boiling point on day 4, when Charles almost got into a physical altercation with Julian inside the guest elevator because Brenda was weeping about the engine noise. The ship's security had to intervene, warning them to keep the peace. Donald was having an even worse time. Having expected an all-expenses-paid, top-shelf alcohol binge, he was forced into involuntary sobriety. He had tried to charge drinks to his cabin card multiple times, only to be rejected by the bartenders. He even tried to beg other passengers to buy him drinks, causing massive embarrassment for Julian. On the 5th night, Donald's desperation got the better of him. He was caught by a buffet steward trying to smuggle a bottle of wine out of a service cart. The ship's security detained him, threatening to put him off the vessel at the next port in Juneau, Alaska. Julian had to spend 3 hours begging the security manager, promising it was a misunderstanding, to avoid having his brother-in-law abandoned in a remote port. They had no access to the outside world. The ship's satellite internet cost exactly $100 per day per device, and since their cards were blocked, they couldn't purchase the access code. The cabin telephone, which allowed calls to landlines, cost $10 per minute, but the service was disabled because they had no credit card on file to secure the charges. They were completely blind, unable to contact Silas Thorne or their bank. According to Gavin, they had pooled all the cash they had in their pockets, crumpled bills they had brought for airport snacks and tips. The total amount of cash between all 5 of them was exactly $84. On day 6, they had spent $12 of that cash on a single can of warm soda and some generic aspirin for Donald, who was suffering from severe headaches, leaving them with exactly $72. They were stuck on a luxury cruise ship with $72 in physical cash, 0 digital credit, and no way to purchase even a bottle of water outside of the complimentary dining hall. They were restricted to the complimentary buffet line, standing in long queues with the economy passengers they had always mocked. For 10 days, they ate the same basic pasta and salad, watching other guests enjoy premium steaks and champagne at the specialty restaurants. In my shipping business, I had seen cargo vessels lose their propulsion systems in the middle of the Pacific. It is a slow, agonizing experience. The ship continues to float, but it has no direction, no steering, and the crew is entirely at the mercy of the elements. That was Julian's reality. He was floating on a multi-million-dollar vessel, surrounded by luxury, but he was completely powerless, drifting toward a catastrophic landing. I stood on the deck of my yacht, watching a school of dolphins break the surface of the Mediterranean. The sea breeze was warm and the sails were full. Julian had wanted a family cruise without me. I had granted his wish, giving him and his wife's family exactly what they deserved: a cold, windowless, sober journey through international waters with nothing to look forward to but their own destruction. The 10-day Alaskan cruise finally came to an end on a cold, gray Seattle morning. I had returned from Nice, France, the night before, feeling completely refreshed. I was sitting in my own quiet kitchen, drinking a hot cup of black coffee, while Gavin Sanchez kept me updated on the terminal disembarkation in real time. In shipping, the arrival of a compromised vessel at the harbor is always a critical phase. You have to monitor the dock closely to see exactly how the damage is assessed. Gavin was parked near the exit doors of the main Seattle cruise terminal, watching the passengers stream out. The contrast was stark. While hundreds of happy, sunburnt travelers walked past, carrying souvenirs and laughing, my son's family looked like survivors of a shipwreck. "They look completely broken, Eugene," Gavin said over the phone. "Patricia's manicure is chipped. Her hair is in a messy knot, and she's wearing the same wrinkled sweatpants she boarded in. Her parents are walking 20 feet behind her, refusing to even look at her or Julian. And Donald is shivering in a thin jacket, looking like a man who hasn't slept in a week. He's pacing, desperately looking for a coffee stand or a smoking area, but he has no cash." They had spent the last 10 days trapped in windowless interior cabins, eating free buffet pasta, and intensely fighting over their empty accounts. They were entirely convinced that a massive automated banking fraud alert had temporarily frozen their cards. Julian believed that the moment they touched dry land and got cell reception, a quick call to the bank would resolve the clerical error. As they walked out of the terminal, Julian immediately pulled out his phone. The cellular signal connected. He opened his mobile banking application, fully expecting to see his normal funds. Instead, the screen refreshed, displaying a stark, bold number. He frantically called the bank's customer service line. A representative named Sarah answered, her voice cold and professional. "Sir, your name was listed as an authorized secondary user on that joint emergency checking account," she explained. However, the primary owner and creator of the account, Eugene Barrett, officially closed the account on Monday morning. All remaining funds, exactly $370,600, were legally transferred to his private solo account. Furthermore, our security team is currently reviewing the 3 withdrawals of $9,800 you made on Monday morning for suspicious transaction patterns. Julian tried to argue, his voice rising in pitch. "You don't understand, Sarah," he shouted. "I'm his son. That money was meant for my security. He cannot just transfer it out without my permission." Sarah remained completely professional. "Sir, our legal team has already reviewed the account authority documents. As the primary grantor and sole funding source, Eugene Barrett holds the absolute unilateral right to close the account and transfer the assets at any time. We are legally bound by his instructions. There is nothing more we can do for you. Good day, sir." Julian stood frozen on the sidewalk, the phone slipping from his hands. When Patricia saw his expression, she began screaming, causing a massive public scene. Charles Garrison stepped forward, his face red with fury. "I knew you were a blue-collar fraud, Julian." Charles sneered, loud enough for other travelers to hear. "You live in a Bellevue mansion, but you can't even secure a basic bank account. Your father is the one with the actual shipping wealth, and you are nothing but a spineless, broke employee." They had exactly $72 left in cash. They couldn't afford a premium rideshare. They had to scrape the crumpled bills together just to pay for a scuffed, poorly maintained, yellow commercial taxi van to Bellevue. Charles and Brenda squeezed into the back seats, refusing to sit near Julian, while Donald sat in the front, shivering. During the 45-minute drive across the bridge, Julian tried to contact their lawyer, Silas Thorne, to execute the emergency guardianship petition. He finally got through to Thorne's office, but instead of reassurance, Thorne's assistant answered in a state of absolute panic. "Julian, Mr. Thorne is not here," the assistant stammered. "The Superior Court judge flagged the staging queue as a fraud yesterday. Dr. Gable's license was suspended by the Department of Health this morning for professional misconduct, and the State Bar has suspended Mr. Thorne's license pending an investigation into a falsified psychiatric affidavit. The FBI has already requested our client files. Do not call this office again. The line went dead. Julian felt his heart drop to the floor. The legal trap they had meticulously designed to bury me alive had completely collapsed, crushing their lawyer and their doctor under the weight of its own fraud. There would be no emergency guardianship. There would be no access to my estate. They were completely exposed. Julian, what is happening? Patricia wailed from the back of the taxi, her voice cracking with terror. Why is the lawyer's office closed? What did they say? Julian couldn't even speak. He stared blankly out the window as the taxi navigated the streets of Bellevue. The only hope he had left, the only anchor in his entire life, was the house. He believed that even if the bank accounts were empty and the legal petition blocked, they could at least return to the Bellevue mansion, sleep in their own beds, and figure out a way to negotiate with me. In shipping logistics, when a captain realizes his vessel is taking on water, his engines failed, and his anchors are gone, he looks for a safe harbor to beach the ship. Julian was desperately steering his family toward the Bellevue mansion, completely unaware that the harbor had already been dismantled, sold, and boarded up. The taxi turned into the cul-de-sac. Julian raised his head, his eyes searching for the familiar cedar facade of the modern estate I had purchased for him. The taxi slowed to a crawl, and the driver looked back, confused. Gavin Sanchez's voice came through my earpiece, calm and descriptive. They just pulled up, Eugene. Julian looks like he's about to pass out. Patricia is staring at the yard. The show is about to start. I leaned back in my kitchen chair, took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee, and waited for the final collision. The yellow commercial taxi van rolled to a stop at the curb of the cul-de-sac. Through my investigator Gavin's live microphone, I could hear the idle thrum of the engine and the quiet patter of the Seattle rain on the hood. Julian and Patricia looked out the window, expecting to see their pristine Bellevue sanctuary. Instead, they were staring at an active construction zone. The manicured green lawn was heavily scarred by deep, muddy tracks left by the heavy wheels of Dante Rossi's roll-off trucks. The flower beds Patricia had spent thousands of dollars installing were trampled and crushed. Driven deep into the sod was a massive bright red commercial real estate sign displaying a single bold word, "Sold," in huge white letters, indicating the transaction had been finalized. The custom front door I had paid for was gone, replaced by a thick sheet of raw plywood secured by steel chains and a heavy commercial padlock. The bay windows were covered in thick plastic sheeting. Julian stepped out of the yellow taxi van first, his expensive, custom-embossed leather travel bag slipping from his hand and splashing heavily into a muddy puddle, completely ruining the leather. He took two shaky, unstable steps toward the center of the driveway, his mouth hanging open, his mind completely unable to process the wreckage in front of him. He was looking at the boarded windows, trying to reconcile this image with the home he had occupied just a week ago. "Julian, what is this?" Patricia screamed, tumbling out of the vehicle. "Why is there a sold sign? What did they do to our house?" She ran toward the porch, her designer boots slipping in the mud. She reached the plywood entrance and began pulling frantically at the steel chains, her hands getting covered in rust and dirt. She pounded on the wood, screaming for someone to open the door, but the house remained dark, hollow, and silent. Gavin Sanchez's voice came through my earpiece. "Patricia is hysterical, Eugene. She's clawing at the plywood. Julian is just standing there like a statue, and the in-laws are stepping out of the taxi." Charles and Brenda Garrison walked to the edge of the driveway, staring at the boarded-up windows. Charles looked at the massive red sign, then at the pile of trash bags stacked on the curb. A crushed titanium golf club protruded from one of the ripped black bags. A soaked designer dress lay spilled in the gutter. On top of the pile was a cardboard sign written in marker, "Free to take." Charles turned to Patricia, his face contorted with disgust. "You told us Julian owned this house," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "You told us we were staying in a Bellevue estate. You dragged us onto a cruise where we were treated like rats, and now you bring us to a construction site?" You married a broke fraud who has nothing. Charles raised his finger, pointing directly at Julian's wet face. You married a fraud. Patricia, he bellowed, his voice carrying down the street. This boy never earned a single dime on his own. His entire career at that logistics company was handed to him on a silver platter by his father. He's a puppet, and you're a fool for believing him. Without his father's money, Julian is absolutely nothing. Dad, no, Patricia sobbed, turning back from the door. It's a mistake. My father-in-law has the money. He must have done this. Julian, tell him. Julian didn't say a word. He was staring at the cardboard sign on the trash. Brenda Garrison stepped forward, her voice rising to a shriek. You are a failure, Patricia. We spent our own savings buying luxury clothes and luggage because you promised us we would be taken care of. Now we have nothing, and we are standing in the mud. I don't ever want to see either of you again. Charles waved down a passing black commercial town car that had just dropped off a neighbor at the estate next door. He didn't even look back at his weeping daughter as he opened the door, ushered Brenda inside the dry passenger cabin, and climbed in himself, completely ignoring Patricia's desperate screams. The town car pulled away, tires splashing dirty water onto the driveway, leaving Julian and Patricia standing alone on the wet sidewalk. Patricia ran after the vehicle for 10 yards, her hands outstretched, before collapsing in the mud as the car disappeared around the corner. Donald Garrison, Patricia's brother, didn't even watch them leave. He was on his knees by the curb, frantically tearing open the black garbage bags, searching for his custom-fitted golf gear and his expensive electronic gaming console. But the rain had soaked everything, and the demolition crew had intentionally smashed his clubs. They're ruined, Donald yelled, throwing a bent driver into the street. Everything is ruined. Julian, you promised me as a luxury trip and a place to stay. I have no money. I have no alcohol, and my clothes are in the garbage. You did this to us. I sat at my kitchen table in my quiet house in Seattle, holding the warm coffee mug in my hands. The rain was still drumming softly against the window glass, a calming sound that perfectly matched my own state of mind. In shipping, when a cargo load is unsecured, the eventual collision is inevitable. You can predict the exact moment the containers will slide off the deck and sink into the sea. Julian had spent years ignoring the structural integrity of his own character, believing my wealth would always act as a permanent buffer against his failures. Now, the buffer was gone, and the impact had shattered his family. Gavin spoke through the receiver. The in-laws have officially abandoned them, Eugene. Julian is sitting on his suitcase in the rain. Patricia is sitting in the mud, crying. Donald is still kicking the garbage bags. What's the next move? Let them sit, I said, my voice level. Julian's phone is going to ring next. He has no money, no home, and his lawyer is suspended. He will have to call the only person he has left. I'll keep the camera active, Gavin said. I hung up the phone. I looked at the photograph of Diane. She had always believed in accountability. Julian was finally facing the raw, unfiltered consequences of his own choices. He had tried to lock his father in a cage to steal his legacy. Now he was locked out of his own life, sitting in the Seattle rain with nothing but $72 and a pile of wet garbage. Julian and Patricia were left sitting on the wet concrete. Donald had already walked away, taking $30 of their remaining cash to buy a bus ticket back to his parents' basement, leaving them with exactly $42. Donald had cursed at them, calling them both idiots, before vanishing down the street. The rain continued to fall, soaking their designer travel bags and the piles of ruined clothing on the curb. Patricia was curled in a ball on the muddy lawn, her designer clothes stained, crying hysterically. Julian sat on his suitcase, staring blankly at the sold sign. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers were shaking. He scrolled through his contacts, stopped at my name, and hit the dial button. I sat at my kitchen table, watching the call illuminate my screen. I let it ring, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. I wanted him to feel the tension, to sit in the cold reality of his ruin for a few more seconds. On the 6th ring, I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I didn't say a word. I stayed completely silent, letting the dead air weigh on him. Dad! Julian's voice came through, high-pitched and hysterical. Dad, is that you? You have to help us. Someone stole our identity. The bank accounts are cleared out, and some corporate flippers boarded up our house. All of our clothes and furniture are in dumpsters on the street. The in-laws abandoned us, and Silas Thorne's office is closed. We are standing in the rain, Dad. You have to call the police and help us. He was practically hyperventilating, desperately trying to play the part of the concerned, victimized son. He believed that if he screamed loud enough, his wealthy father would immediately swoop in and write a check to fix everything. I took a slow, quiet breath. When I spoke, my voice was a calm, steady whisper that cut through his panic like a steel blade. I sold the house, Julian, I said, and I closed the joint account. The silence that followed was absolute. Over the receiver, I could hear the faint sound of the Bellevue traffic and Patricia's distant crying, but Julian didn't make a sound. Dad? He stammered, his voice cracking. What are you talking about? You sold our house? How could you do that? It was in the trust. We were on a cruise for Patty's mental health. We were going to pay you back for the ticket. We are your family. How could you leave us homeless on the street? He was still trying to use the mental script Patricia had written for him, pleading for sympathy and using the false promise of a reimbursement plan. I do not have Alzheimer's, Julian, I said, enunciating every syllable. The silence returned, heavier this time. I knew exactly what was happening in his head. The realization was hitting him that the foundation of his entire plot had cracked. I stood in your hallway last Tuesday morning, Julian, I continued, my voice cold and level. I used my master key to enter the garage, and I walked up the utility stairs. I stood outside your cracked master bedroom door for 10 minutes. I heard every single word of your conversation with Patricia and Donald. I paused, letting the memory of his betrayal wash over him. I heard Patricia bragging about how easy it was to manipulate the stupid old man. I heard Donald joking about drinking enough top-shelf liquor on my card to put me in a financial grave. And I heard you, Julian. I heard you expressing concern about the legal papers, while admitting that I was perfectly fine and just missing your mother. I could hear his breathing turn into short, panicked gasps. I heard Patricia explain that your father-in-law's doctor had already signed a fraudulent medical affidavit stating I had advanced cognitive decline, I said. I heard her outline the plan to file an emergency guardianship petition next Tuesday while you were in international waters, and to have a medical transport team waiting at my front door to lock me in a secure memory facility. I know about the 3 structured withdrawals of $9,800 you made to bribe the doctor and pay Silas Thorne. Dad, please, Julian whispered, his voice cracking into a sob. Patty forced me. She said we were going to lose the inheritance. She said you were going to leave the shipping assets to a charity. I didn't want to do it, Dad. I swear I was terrified the whole time. You stood there silently while they mocked your mother's memory, I replied. You stood silently while they plotted to strip away my human rights and bury me alive. You signed the draft petition, Julian. You are the primary petitioner listed on the court document. Your signature is on the file. Diane raised you to be a man of integrity, but you have proved to have absolutely zero structural strength. You have her last name, but you possess none of her character. In my logistics business, if a first mate coordinates with pirates to hijack the vessel and lock the captain in the hold, he doesn't get to plead that he was forced into it once the cargo is recaptured. He faces the gallows. Julian had actively participated in a conspiracy to destroy my life, and now he was trying to hide behind his own weakness. You aren't my son anymore, Julian, I said. You're just a compromised contractor who tried to steal my cargo, and I have officially terminated your contract. Dad, no! Julian sobbed, his panic rising. We have no money. We have no place to sleep tonight. Patricia is sitting in the mud. We only have $42. You can't leave us like this. You wanted to lock me in a room where I couldn't even make a phone call, I said. You wanted to take my estate and leave me with nothing. You should be glad you have $42 and a pile of wet garbage. That is far more than you planned to leave me with. I ended the call. The screen went dark, and I placed the phone flat on the table. The rain was still beating against the kitchen window, but inside, the air was warm, quiet, and completely still. The storm had finally passed, and the shipping lanes were clear. When the phone line went dead, Julian sat on his damp leather suitcase on the Bellevue curb, his hands covering his face. Beside him, Patricia had stopped wailing. Her silence was short-lived, however, quickly replaced by a hot, toxic fury. She scrambled out of the mud, grabbed Julian by his collar, and began shaking him violently. "What did he say?" she shrieked, her fingernails digging into his jacket. "Julian, tell me, what did the old man say? Why isn't he sending a car? Why isn't he calling the bank?" "He knows," Julian whispered, his voice completely hollow. He stared at his muddy boots. "He heard us, Patty. He was in the house last Tuesday. He stood outside our door. He heard everything. The doctor, the guardianship. He knows about the cash withdrawals." Patricia froze, her hands slipping from his collar. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with terror as the magnitude of their failure settled in. But she quickly recovered, her panic turning into desperation. "Then we go to my parents," she said, dragging her wet suitcase toward the street. "We have no choice. We can't stay on this sidewalk. My father will know what to do. He has connections. We'll stay at their estate in Medina until Silas Thorne figures out a way to fight this." They had exactly $42 left. A taxi to Medina would cost almost the entire amount, but they were too exhausted and wet to walk. Julian waved down a passing cab, and they piled their damp bags into the trunk. The drive was silent, the air inside heavy with the scent of wet wool and silent resentment. As the cab glided through the rainy Bellevue streets, Julian stared out the window, his mind drifting back to a conversation he had with his mother Diane years ago. Diane had always been exceptionally perceptive about people. When Julian first introduced Patricia and her parents, Diane had pulled him aside in our kitchen and warned him. She said, "The Garrisons were like barnacles on a shipping hull. They would cling to our wealth, slowing us down, but the moment the ship hit rough waters, they would be scraped off without a thought." Julian had ignored her warnings, calling her old-fashioned and suspicious. Now, sitting in the back of a cheap taxi, he was realizing his mother had been completely right. In logistics, when a shipping vessel loses all power and is towed to a hostile dock, the crew knows they are at the mercy of the port authorities. Julian and Patricia were drifting toward the Garrison estate, believing it was a safe harbor. They didn't realize that in the world of high-end social climbing, a sinking ship is immediately abandoned to protect the cargo of those still afloat. The taxi pulled up to the heavy, wrought iron gates of the Garrison estate in Medina. The gates were closed, the security lights illuminating the brick pillars. Julian handed the taxi driver his last $40, leaving them with exactly $2 in change. They dragged their bags to the gate intercom, and Patricia pressed the call button. It rang for a long time. Finally, the intercom buzzed, and Charles Garrison's voice came through, cold and distant. "Who is it?" "Dad, it's me!" Patricia cried, pressing her face close to the metal speaker. "Open the gates, please. It's pouring. Julian's father sold our house. We are homeless, Dad. We have no money. Let us in, please." There was a long pause. I could hear the static hum of the intercom through Gavin's secondary audio feed from the street. "No, Patricia," Charles said, his voice flat. Patricia gasped, stepping back. "Dad? What do you mean? It's me. I'm your daughter." "You brought a federal storm to my front door, Patricia," Charles said, his tone hardening. "Silas Thorne called my private line an hour ago before his office was locked. The state bar has suspended him, and Dr. Gable is under investigation by the state. But worse, the FBI has already contacted our family accountants. They are auditing our business records because of the structured cash withdrawals you made from Eugene's account. They think we participated in a financial conspiracy." "Dad, we didn't mean to," Patricia sobbed, pounding on the brick pillar. "It was Julian's account. We just needed the cash for the doctor." "I don't care about your excuses," Charles snapped. "You lied to us. You told us Julian was the sole heir and that you had the estate secured. Instead, you dragged my name into a federal investigation. Brenda and I are not going to ruin our social standing and face criminal charges to shelter you. Donald is already inside, and he has told us everything. You are on your own, Patricia. Do not call this house again." The intercom went dead. Patricia fell to her knees on the wet asphalt, screaming and clawing at the iron bars of the gate. She looked up at the main house. Through the second-story windows, she could see the warm glow of the chandeliers. Donald Garrison was standing behind the glass, holding a glass of juice, looking down at his sister on the street. He didn't wave. He simply pulled the heavy curtains closed, erasing them from his view. Julian stood behind her, his head bowed against the rain. He had spent his entire marriage trying to please Patricia and her Hing family, sacrificing his relationship with me and desecrating his mother's memory just to be accepted into their elite circle. Now, the moment the money was gone and the federal authorities were involved, they had locked him out like a common trespasser. In shipping, when a crew attempts a cargo heist and fails, the corporate sponsors never step forward to pay their bail. They erase the paper trail and deny any association. Charles and Brenda Garrison were corporate social climbers. They had no loyalty to a daughter who was no longer useful. Julian looked at Patricia, who was sobbing in the mud outside the locked gates of her family home. They had no money, no shelter, and the temperature was dropping. They were completely shipwrecked, and the legal storm I had unleashed was just starting to gather on the horizon. Outside the heavy iron gates of the Garrison estate, the temperature continued to drop. Patricia lay in the wet grass, her face smeared with mud and running mascara, screaming at the closed windows of her parents' home. Julian stood in the rain, staring at the gate intercom speaker. With only $2 left in his pocket, they were completely out of options. Medina is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the Seattle area, and its streets are heavily patrolled by private security. It didn't take long for our actions to draw attention. Within 15 minutes, a white patrol vehicle with flashing yellow lights pulled up to the curb. A security officer stepped out, keeping his hand near his belt as he looked at their wet bags and disheveled appearance. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his voice polite but firm. "Loitering or blocking residential entrances is not permitted in this area. If you don't live at this address, I need you to move along." Patricia scrambled up, trying to explain that this was her father's house, but the officer checked the intercom register. Charles Garrison had already called the security desk to report trespassers outside his gate. The officer made it clear they had to leave immediately, or he would call the local police to issue a formal citation for trespassing. With no money for a taxi, they were forced to drag their heavy, waterlogged bags down the dark streets of Medina, walking back toward the commercial edge of Bellevue. The walk took nearly 2 hours. The damp cold seeped through their wet clothes, and Patricia's designer boots began to fall apart, the soles separating from the leather. As they walked along the shoulder of the highway, expensive luxury cars sped past, splashing them with dirty road water, a brutal reminder of the wealthy lifestyle they had just been evicted from. Eventually, they reached a rundown, low-budget motel on the highway bypass, a place with a flickering neon sign that read, "The Cascade Lodge." The air inside the lobby smelled of damp carpets, cheap disinfectant, and stale tobacco. A cynical clerk sat behind a bulletproof glass window, barely looking up from his phone. $85 a night plus tax, the clerk said flatly when Julian asked for a room. Julian pulled out his phone, trying to explain that his cards were temporarily frozen by a bank error. The clerk shrugged. "No card, no cash, no room, move along." Patricia stepped forward, her voice desperate. She unclasped the gold-plated designer watch from her wrist, an item she had purchased on my credit card last winter for $4,500, claiming she needed it for high society networking events. "This watch is worth thousands of dollars," she said, pushing it through the service slot. "It's real gold. Just give us a room for the night. We'll pay you cash tomorrow." The clerk picked up the watch, squinted at the casing, and let out a dry laugh. "This is a cheap replica. The gold plating is already wearing off the clasp. It's worth maybe $20 at a pawn shop," he threw it back. "But I'm in a good mood. I'll give you the economy room in the back for the watch and your last $2. One night. Checkout is at 10 in the morning." Patricia nodded frantically, taking the key. They walked down a drafty corridor to a room with peeling floral wallpaper, a sagging queen bed, and a television that only played static. The moment the door shut, the silence between them shattered. Through Gavin's local listening device, I heard the beginning of their final, ugly collapse. Patricia began throwing her wet shoes at Julian, screaming that he was a weak, spineless coward who had ruined her life. She cursed my name, then cursed Julian for failing to secure the estate. Julian finally snapped, his voice rising as he yelled back, pointing out that Patricia's greed and her family's hing demands were the exact reason they were sitting in a cheap motel lobby with nothing. While they were screaming at each other in that dingy room, I was sitting on the deck of the Sea Falcon in the harbor of Saint-Tropez. Pierre had secured the yacht, and a warm Mediterranean breeze rustled the sails. My phone rang. It was Gideon Cole. "Eugene," Gideon said, his voice carrying the calm satisfaction of a lawyer who had just won a major contract. "Dante Rossi's crews have finished clearing the Bellevue house. The deed transfer is officially recorded. The funds are settled in your solo account, and the house is boarded up. More importantly, the DOH has formally suspended Dr. Ronald Gable's medical license, and Silas Thorne has been served with a state bar suspension notice." Gavin was there when the FBI agents walked into Thorne's office with a federal warrant. They seized his computer servers and boxed up all his client files. "Has the civil lawsuit been served?" I asked. "Yes," Gideon chuckled. "The process server delivered the complaint to the Bellevue address, but since they weren't there, he posted it on the plywood door. It's legally served. We have a hearing for the civil protection order scheduled for next month." "Excellent work, Gideon," I said. "What about Julian and Patricia?" "Gavin tracked them to a cheap motel on the highway," Gideon said. "They are currently screaming at each other in a room that costs $85. They have no money, no lawyer, and no friends left. The Garrison family has completely locked them out to protect their own business from the federal audit." I looked out at the lights of Saint-Tropez reflecting on the dark water. In logistics, when a shipping container is lost at sea, you write it off and file the insurance claim. You don't try to salvage the rusted metal from the bottom of the ocean. Julian was a write-off. He had chosen his crew, and now he was sinking with them. "Keep the thumb too on them, Gideon," I said. "Let's see how they handle checkout tomorrow morning." At exactly 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the neon sign of the Cascade Lodge buzzed as the rain continued to fall. Julian and Patricia stood outside on the asphalt of the highway bypass, their wet, dirty suitcases beside them. The cynical motel clerk had stood in the doorway, key in hand, and watched them walk out without a word. They had $0, zero credit, and their phone plans were on the verge of suspension. As they stood on the shoulder of the highway, shivering in the damp air, Julian's phone began to vibrate. He grabbed it quickly, hoping it was some sort of relief. The caller identification displayed the name of his employer, Mr. Henderson, the vice president of operations at the marine shipping firm where Julian worked, the very firm I had founded and sold years ago, but where I still held massive influence and stock. "Julian," Mr. Henderson's voice came through. Cold and strictly professional, there was no warm greeting. "Mr. Henderson," Julian said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry I didn't check in this morning. We just got back from the cruise, and we are dealing with a massive administrative banking error." "I'm not calling about your attendance, Julian," Henderson interrupted, his tone cutting him off. "An hour ago, our legal department was officially served with a writ of garnishment from Cole and Associates, representing Eugene Barrett. It is tied to a civil lawsuit filed against you for elder financial exploitation, seeking damages of $90,000. Furthermore, we received a federal notification from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division regarding an audit into structured cash transactions. Your father built this shipping firm from the ground up, Julian. He is a legend in this harbor, and we still do business with his partners. The fact that you tried to legally declare him incompetent to steal his assets is not only a massive corporate liability, it is personally disgusting. I will not have a man of your character managing our logistics teams." Julian's jaw dropped. He gripped the phone, his face pale. "The company cannot be associated with active federal investigations or civil lawsuits of this nature," Mr. Henderson continued. "Under Section 12 of our corporate bylaws, you are suspended immediately without pay, pending the final outcome of these legal matters. Your company email and network access have been deactivated. I need you to mail your security badge and company laptop back to the main terminal by Friday. Do not return to the shipyard." The line went dead. Julian's last source of income, his professional standing, and his security access card were gone. He looked at Patricia, his eyes wide with absolute despair. "I'm fired," he whispered. "Henderson suspended me. The company got the lawsuit in the federal audit." Patricia stared at him, her mouth opening, but before she could scream, her own phone vibrated. It was a text message from her brother Donald. She opened it quickly. "Patty, do not call Mom or Dad," the text read. "Gavin Sanchez's process servers just showed up at the Medina gates. They served Mom and Dad with a civil subpoena to testify under oath in the elder abuse lawsuit. Dad is furious. He almost had a stroke, smashing a glass on the kitchen table, when he realized our family name is dragged into this. He's already hired a high-priced criminal defense firm. They are drafting a formal statement for the prosecutors, placing all the blame for the doctor's bribe on you and Julian. They are going to throw you both to the wolves to protect the Garrison family business. And I'm going to the FBI tomorrow to tell them about the cash withdrawals so I don't get indicted as a co-conspirator. You're on your own." Patricia dropped the phone onto her suitcase. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her parents, whom she had tried so hard to impress and pamper with my money, had completely abandoned her. She stared at the screen, tears of pure anger and betrayal spilling down her cheeks. She had spent the last 5 years acting like a high-society princess, bragging to her friends about her wealthy family and her luxury lifestyle. Now she was standing on the side of a highway, and her own parents were treating her like she was a common criminal. They were actively constructing a legal wall to shut her out, willing to sacrifice their own daughter to preserve their wealth and social standing. Even her lazy brother, Donald, was ready to turn state's evidence to save his own skin. They were ready to watch her go to prison just to keep their own hands clean. In shipping logistics, when a cargo theft ring is exposed, the ringleaders don't protect the dock workers who moved the freight. They immediately hand over the names of the low-level operators to the federal prosecutors, claiming they were entirely unaware of the scheme. Charles Garrison was a corporate manager. He knew how to manage liabilities, and Patricia was now the largest liability on his ledger. Julian and Patricia were completely alone, standing on the side of a wet highway, bankrupt, homeless, unemployed, and abandoned by the very family they had conspired with. The legal nets I had cast with Gideon Cole and Agent Miller were tightening, closing every avenue of escape, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. I sat in a cafe in Saint-Tropez watching the luxury yachts bobbing in the water. The sun was warm, the sky clear. My phone buzzed with a message from Gideon. Writ of garnishment served to Julian's employer. Company suspended him immediately. Charles Garrison has hired a defense firm to distance himself. The Garrisons are fracturing. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm sea breeze. When a ship's hull is rotten, you don't try to repair it. You let the sea pressure crush the remaining wood. Julian and Patricia were feeling the full pressure of their own rot, and the hull was about to give way completely. While Julian and Patricia were wandering the highway edges of Bellevue, Patricia's brother, Donald Garrison, was growing desperate. After abandoning his sister at the gates in Medina and returning to his parents' basement, he realized his comfortable life of playing video games and drinking free alcohol was over. The FBI audit on the Garrison family business had terrified Charles Garrison, who had cut off Donald's allowance. Donald had zero funds, and his custom golf clubs and designer clothes were gone. He was suffering from severe nicotine and alcohol withdrawal, and he was willing to do anything to get some quick cash. He thought of the Bellevue house, specifically his gaming console and the expensive bottles of whiskey he had left in the pantry. He figured he could break in, grab them, and sell them at a local pawn shop. On Wednesday afternoon, Donald took a bus back to the Bellevue cul-de-sac. He walked along the back hedge, keeping out of sight of the street, and slipped into the backyard. The estate looked completely different. The windows were boarded with heavy plywood, and the custom landscaping was gouged by Dante Rossi's trucks. Donald walked to the window well near the basement stairs, pulled away the temporary plastic covering, and tried to pry open the sash using a rusted iron pipe he found in the yard. He was sweating, panting under the weight of his own anxiety, looking over his shoulder every few seconds. He kept telling himself that this was his house, that he had a right to be here, but his shaking hands betrayed his guilt. He jammed the rusted pipe into the wooden frame, applying all his weight, the wood groaning loudly in the quiet afternoon as he desperately tried to force it open. What Donald didn't know was that Dante Rossi was an exceptionally professional corporate flipper who secured all his real estate investments like a military cargo hold. The moment the title had cleared on Monday, Dante's team had installed temporary cellular security system with motion sensors and high-definition cameras. The moment Donald began prying at the window, silent alarms triggered at the security desk. Within 10 minutes, a Bellevue police cruiser and a private security vehicle pulled into the driveway, blocking the exit. Donald was caught red-handed, his pipe wedged under the window frame, his hands covered in dirt. The officers ordered him to the wet ground, pulled his muddy arms behind his back, and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. He was arrested for attempted residential burglary under Washington law, specifically RCW 9A.52.0225. The moment the handcuffs clicked, Donald's spineless character gave way completely. He began weeping, begging the officers not to take him to jail. His name was already flagged in the National NCIC database as a subject of interest in our active federal elder fraud investigation, so the Bellevue officers immediately recognized him. "I don't live here, but my sister did," Donald babbled, his voice cracking as the officers escorted him to the back of the cruiser. "I was just trying to get my belongings. I'm not a thief. The real criminals are my sister, Patricia, and her husband, Julian Barrett. They are the ones you want. They stole $30,000 from a joint account and used it to bribe a psychiatrist, Dr. Ronald Gable, to declare Julian's dad insane. They have a lawyer named Silas Thorne. Check the court files. They forced me to go on the cruise. I didn't do anything." The officers recorded his statements on their body cams because Gideon Cole and I had already flagged the emergency guardianship fraud with the local court and the FBI. The Bellevue police immediately contacted Agent Miller at the Seattle Federal Field Office. Donald's frantic, weeping confession was the final piece of coordinates the federal investigators needed to map the conspiracy and finalize their arrest warrants. Gavin Sanchez called my phone as I was having dinner at a small, candlelit seaside restaurant in Saint-Tropez, watching the warm lights of Nice reflecting on the dark, quiet water in the distance. I'd ordered a fresh plate of seafood and a bottle of local white wine, enjoying the quiet evening. "Eugene," Gavin said, "Donald Garrison was just arrested for attempting to break into the Bellevue property." I was parked down the street, watching. He looked completely pathetic, muddy, terrified, and shaking like a leaf. The moment they handcuffed him, he completely broke down. He confessed to the doctor's bribe, the structured cash withdrawals, and pointed the finger directly at Julian and Patricia. He gave the police the exact details of the transaction. "Did they record the confession?" I asked, cutting my steak. "Yes," Gavin laughed. "It's on body cam footage. The Bellevue police have already forwarded the files to Agent Miller at the FBI. Donald is currently sitting in the county jail, and he's practically begging to sign a formal affidavit against his sister to avoid a burglary charge. He's completely turned on them." "And Julian and Patricia? They are currently sitting at a bus stop near the Bellevue Transit Center," Gavin said. "Patricia saw a local police alert about the arrest on her phone. She is hysterical. Julian is just staring at his feet. They know the police are closing in, and they have nowhere left to run." In logistics, if a shipping vessel is structurally compromised, the crew will eventually start throwing each other overboard to lighten the load and save their own skins. Donald had been the first to jump, sacrificing his own sister to avoid a cell. Julian and Patricia were now completely isolated on the deck, and the federal investigators were preparing to board. I hung up, took a sip of my wine, and looked at the Mediterranean. Julian had spent his life enabling Patricia's family, believing they were his allies. Now his brother-in-law had hand-delivered the evidence to the police. His father-in-law was preparing a defense to protect himself. And Julian was left holding the bill for a failed mutiny. By Thursday morning, the Seattle sky was heavy and dark, pouring a cold, relentless rain over the highway bypass. Julian and Patricia were sitting in a corner booth of a dingy, metal-paneled roadside diner, trying to warm their hands around a single cup of cheap black coffee. The air inside the diner was thick with the smell of greasy bacon, burnt toast, and damp coats. A few local construction workers in high-visibility vests sat at the counter, talking quietly, while a truck driver in a corner booth read a newspaper, completely ignoring the two miserable passengers in the corner. They had spent the night sleeping in the bus shelter, shivering and exhausted. Their clothes were damp and wrinkled, and Patricia's face was pale, her expensive makeup completely washed away. They were discussing their survival options. Patricia wanted Julian to go to a payday lender, or try to find a pawn shop that would accept his wedding ring. But Julian was too hollow to answer. He knew his credit was destroyed, his employment terminated, and his reputation in the shipping community completely ruined. The bell above the diner door jingled, but it wasn't a local truck driver walking in. Three dark, unmarked SUVs pulled into the gravel parking lot, their tires throwing up wet mud. Through the diner windows, Julian watched in terror as multiple federal agents in dark jackets with the bold yellow letters stepped out of the vehicles. They moved with a synchronized, mechanical precision that was chilling. Four agents walked into the diner, their hands resting near their sidearms. Diner patrons watched in silence as the agents scanned the room and locked their eyes on the corner booth. Seated across from them, Agent Miller stepped forward, holding a folder containing the federal arrest warrants. Julian Barrett and Patricia Barrett, Agent Miller said, his voice carrying the institutional authority of the federal government. You are under arrest. You are charged with conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, structuring financial transactions to evade federal reporting requirements under 31 U.S.C. 5324, and wire fraud. Patricia jumped up, knocking her cold coffee mug over, the dark liquid spilling across the table. Her voice rose in a hysterical shriek. You can't arrest me. I'm a Garrison. My father is Charles Garrison, and he will have your jobs. This is a mistake. My husband is the one who took the money. He's the one who signed the bank papers. I didn't do anything. Agent Miller didn't flinch or show any emotion. He opened the folder, revealing the formal legal documents. Mrs. Barrett, your father Charles Garrison has already signed a formal statement cooperating with the U.S. Attorney's Office, completely disowning any involvement in your activities. Furthermore, your brother Donald Garrison has signed an affidavit detailing the entire conspiracy, including the 3 structured cash withdrawals of $9,800 used to bribe Dr. Ronald Gable. Your doctor has turned state's evidence, and your lawyer, Silas Thorne, is currently in federal custody. Patricia gasped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She turned to Julian, her eyes wide with betrayal, but Julian didn't even look at her. An agent stepped into the booth, pulled Patricia's hands behind her back, and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. She began thrashing and screaming, cursing her family, her brother and Julian, as they escorted her out of the diner into the pouring rain. Julian didn't offer any physical resistance. He stood up slowly, keeping his arms at his sides. He looked at Agent Miller, his eyes completely empty. He had spent his entire life trying to climb into Patricia's high society circle, believing that escaping my blue-collar shipyard world would make him a successful man. Instead, he was leaving the diner in handcuffs, his name forever tied to a federal conspiracy case. The agent cuffed Julian's wrists, his grip firm. They escorted him out, his wet suitcase left behind under the diner booth. I received the call from Agent Miller while I was sitting in the captain's cabin of the Sea Falcon, anchored in the harbor of Saint-Tropez. The rain was drumming softly against the mahogany deck above me, but the cabin was warm and smelled of leather and brass polish. It reminded me of the Seattle shipyard cabins I used to manage, but here the air was clean and my mind was entirely at peace. Mr. Barrett, Agent Miller said over the satellite line, we have officially executed the warrants. Julian and Patricia Barrett were arrested at a roadside diner in Bellevue at 9:30 this morning. They are currently being transported to the federal holding facility in Seattle. Did they offer any resistance? I asked, my voice calm. The wife was combative, trying to claim her family connections, Miller said. But once we explained that her father and brother had already turned on her, she collapsed. Your son didn't say a word. He looked like a man who knew the voyage was over. Thank you, Agent Miller, I said. I appreciate your thoroughness. We will keep your attorney, Gideon Cole, updated on the arraignment schedule, Miller said. But with the doctor's confession, the brother's affidavit, and the banking transaction logs, this is an open and shut case. They will likely face significant prison time. They will be arraigned in federal court tomorrow morning. Since they have no liquid assets left to secure a bond, they will remain in detention. It's a sad situation, Mr. Barrett, but they built their own cage. I hung up the phone and looked out the port window at the lights of Saint-Tropez. In shipping logistics, when a vessel is seized by federal authorities for smuggling or fraud, the owner doesn't try to clear the name. The cargo is impounded, the hull is anchored, and the crew is processed. Julian had attempted to steer my life into a dark hold, believing I was too weak to navigate. Now, he was the one locked in a cell, and the shipping lanes ahead of me were entirely open. Exactly 3 weeks after the federal arrests, I officially returned to the city of Seattle. The warm Mediterranean sun had been replaced by the crisp, cool autumn air of the Pacific Northwest. I sat in Gideon Cole's downtown office, looking out the large glass window at the container ships sliding slowly across Elliott Bay. In shipping, once a damaged vessel is brought to the scrapyard, the final insurance settlement and salvage reports must be reviewed to close the ledger. Gideon walked into the room, carrying a thin, clean manila folder. He had a genuine look of quiet, professional satisfaction on his face. The final cargo manifests are settled, Eugene, he said, placing the folder on the desk. Julian and Patricia's defense attorneys realized they had zero leverage, facing the bank transaction logs, Dr. Gable's confession, Donald's affidavit, and Thorne's internal files. They had no choice but to negotiate plea agreements with the U.S. Attorney's Office to avoid maximum sentences. What are the terms? I asked. The federal judge signed the sentencing orders yesterday morning, Gideon said, opening the file. For conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation and structuring financial transactions to evade federal reporting under 31 U.S.C. 5324, they received substantial prison time. In the courtroom, Julian looked like he was about to collapse, shaking as the charges were read. Patricia, however, sat in stony silence. Her parents, Charles and Brenda, refused to pay for a private defense team or even attend the hearing. She was represented by a court-appointed public defender, a brutal calm-down for a woman who had spent years trying to climb into Medina's high society. He pointed to the first document. Julian was sentenced to exactly 3 years, 36 months, at the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon. The judge noted that while Julian had no prior criminal record, his active participation in a plot to declare his own father incompetent was a severe moral failure. He will serve the full time, with no possibility of early parole under federal rules. And Patricia? The judge designated Patricia as the primary organizer and mastermind of the conspiracy, Gideon said, showing me the second sheet. She was sentenced to exactly 5 years, 60 months at the federal women's facility. The judge was disgusted by her greed, noting that she drove the plot from the beginning, organizing the bribe and forging the medical documents. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of the $29,400 they stole from the joint account, plus civil court fees. What about Silas Thorne and Dr. Gable? Silas Thorne has been permanently disbarred by the Washington State Bar Association. Gideon smiled, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. His prestigious Bellevue law offices have been completely cleared out, the gold leaf nameplate stripped from the heavy mahogany door. He was sentenced to exactly 4 years in a federal penitentiary for professional conspiracy and mail fraud. Dr. Ronald Gable permanently lost his license to practice medicine in the state of Washington, was fined $50,000, and received a 2-year suspended prison sentence in exchange for his early cooperation and testifying against Patricia. His clinic has been boarded up, and his career is permanently finished. I leaned back in the leather chair, looking at the Elliott Bay ships. The legal net had swept them all away. Silas Thorne's law practice was dismantled. Dr. Gable's clinic was gone. and Julian and Patricia were headed to separate federal penitentiaries. They had set out to strip away my freedom and lock me in a windowless room so they could spend my wealth. Instead, they had spent the last of their stolen cash on a cheap motel, and now they were heading to concrete cells where their lives would be scheduled by federal guards. The court also granted the permanent civil protection order, Gideon added, handing me a final document bearing a judge's signature. It legally bars Julian, Patricia, Donald, and the entire Garrison family from ever contacting you, coming within 500 feet of your person, or approaching any property owned by your trust. If they even send an email or a letter, they will be immediately arrested for a parole violation. And Donald? I asked. Donald managed to avoid the burglary conviction by signing the federal cooperation agreement early, Gideon explained. But his father Charles was so completely disgusted by the public scandal and the IRS audit that he kicked Donald out of the Medina house for good, leaving him with nothing. Donald is currently living in a cramped, shared room in a rundown boarding house in Tacoma, working a minimum wage job at a local car wash. Charles and Brenda Garrison's real estate development business is facing a massive tax penalty because of the audit, and their social standing in Medina is completely destroyed. They are pariahs, completely ignored by their former friends and shut out of the elite country clubs. I took a slow, deep breath of feeling a profound sense of closure. In my logistics business, if a vessel is declared a total constructive loss, the owner sells it for scrap metal, walks away and uses the insurance payout to commission a new, stronger ship. I had scrapped the parasitic elements of my family. Julian was no longer my responsibility. He had chosen his port, aligned with a corrupt crew, and now he had to serve his time in the hold. "Thank you for everything, Gideon," I said, standing up and shaking his hand. "It was an honor, Eugene," Gideon said. "You protected your cargo and you cleared the channel. What's your next move?" "I have a new vessel to build," I smiled. "A way to honor Diane's memory properly." I walked out of the high-rise downtown office building into the clean, crisp Seattle air, taking a deep, healing breath of the damp, salty wind. The clouds were parting, letting the bright afternoon sun light up the blue waters of Puget Sound. The heavy legal engines had completed their work, the anchors were secure, the storm had passed, and my life was entirely my own again. On a cool, sunny Friday morning, I met Gideon Cole at a small popular harbor cafe near the Bainbridge Island ferry terminal. We sat at a quiet outdoor table where we could watch the massive white and green morning ferry dock. The weather had cleared beautifully, leaving the sky a bright, clean blue, and the calm waters of the Sound sparkled in the light. I had spent the last few days looking at a small, beautiful timber frame cabin situated on a quiet cove on Whidbey Island, overlooking the shipping lanes where my container vessels used to pass. I sat directly across from Gideon, a thick folder of draft trust agreements and legal charters laid out on the wooden table between us. "I want to finalize the foundation, Gideon," I said, taking a sip of black coffee. "I've drafted the corporate charter under Washington law," Gideon said, opening his sleek silver laptop. "We are setting it up as a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization. We've named it the Diane Barrett Foundation for Elder Justice. I think it's a perfect tribute." "It is," I said, looking out at the ferry crossing the water. Diane spent her life volunteering at community shelters, helping families who had been pushed aside. She believed that everyone deserved protection, especially those who couldn't fight for themselves. She would have been disgusted by what Julian tried to do, but she would be proud that we are using his failure to protect others. I had decided to seed the foundation with exactly $2.0 million in cash. This included the entire $1.76 million cash payout I had received from Dante Rossi for the sale of the Bellevue mansion, plus some additional capital from my personal accounts. I wanted every single, clean dollar that Julian and Patricia had tried to steal from me to be redirected towards stopping people just like them. The Foundation's primary mission will be funding free legal representation for senior citizens who are facing predatory guardianships, fraudulent medical affidavits, or financial exploitation by their own relatives, Gideon explained, scrolling through the bylaws. "We will set up an emergency hotline and partner with the State Department of Social and Health Services. We'll also fund legal audits to help seniors secure their assets in irrevocable trusts, ensuring their families cannot manipulate them. In addition, we will establish educational seminars for county judges and local prosecutors to help them identify warning signs of elder financial abuse and court manipulation. I want you to act as the primary legal trustee, Gideon, I said. We need to ensure that the foundation is run with the same structural efficiency as my old shipping firm. No leak in the hull, no loose cargo. Every dollar must go toward the defense of these seniors. I would be honored, Eugene, Gideon said, his expression serious. We will ensure that the court system has a permanent watchdog. Predatory lawyers like Silas Thorne won't be able to exploit the system when they know we are funding the defense. With the foundation established, I felt a deep, permanent shift in my life. For years, I had built a shipping empire, moving millions of tons of cargo across the Pacific Ocean, believing that creating wealth was the ultimate goal of a man's life. But once Diane passed, the wealth had become a target, drawing parasites who saw my age as an opportunity to hijack the vessel. In defending myself, I realized that my wealth wasn't just a personal asset. It was a tool for justice. It was a shield to protect the vulnerable and a sword to cut down those who sought to exploit them. I had spent decades building container vessels, but this foundation was the most important cargo I had ever carried. I officially finalized my purchase of the Whidbey Island cabin that very afternoon, signing the papers on the hood of my truck. It was a simple, sturdy home built from local western red cedar and Douglas fir, featuring a stone fireplace and a large deck that hung directly over the rocky beach. The air there smelled of sea salt, pine needles, and fresh rain. It was far smaller than the Bellevue mansion, but it had a structural honesty that the modern estate lacked. I spent the weekend moving my personal belongings. Diane's favorite books, her framed photographs, and the simple mahogany furniture we had purchased together when we were young. I even spent a few hours building a custom bookshelf in the living room using local timber, feeling the familiar wood grain under my hands. As the sun began to set on Sunday evening, I sat on my new deck, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The water below was quiet, reflecting the pink and orange hues of the sky. In the distance, a massive container ship glided silently toward the port of Seattle, its navigation lights blinking against the dark horizon. I looked at the framed photo of Diane sitting on the table beside me. "It's secure, Diane," I whispered. "The cargo is safe, the parasites are gone, and your name will protect others." I felt a mix of sadness and acceptance when I thought of Julian. He was my son, and a part of me would always mourn the boy he used to be. But you cannot force a rotten timber to hold up a ship's deck. Eventually, you must let it fail and rebuild a stronger structure. Julian had chosen his path, and now he had to walk it. Julian and Patricia had wanted to lock me in a cold, windowless room in a private facility, stripping away my connection to the water, my freedom, and my memory. Instead, they were the ones locked in concrete cells in federal prison, while I sat on a deck overlooking the open sea, surrounded by the memories of the only person who had ever truly loved me. My shipping empire was gone, but my life was clean, my heading was true, and I had finally reached a safe, quiet harbor. 6 months had passed since the federal sentencing, and the seasons had cycled from a wet Seattle winter to a crisp, bright spring. I sat quietly by the large stone fireplace in my Whidbey Island cabin, a mug of warm tea in my hands. Outside, the spring weather in the Pacific Northwest was exceptionally beautiful. The majestic western red cedars were vibrant and green. The wild blackberries were beginning to bloom along the edge of the dark woods, and a pair of bald eagles were soaring high over the quiet, glistening waters of the bay. I had developed a simple, peaceful, and slow daily routine for myself, waking up early with the sunrise, walking along the cold, rocky beach to collect pieces of weathered driftwood, and reading historical books in the afternoon, completely at peace with my choices. I was reading the first official quarterly progress report of the Diane Barrett Foundation for Elder Justice, which Gideon Cole had sent to my private mailbox. In shipping logistics, the efficiency of a new route is measured by the cargo volume and delivery safety. I wanted to see exactly how our new vessel was performing in the legal channels. The report was a source of profound pride. "We have officially launched the emergency hotline," Gideon had written in his summary. In the first 90 days of operation, the hotline received over 200 calls from seniors, social workers, and concerned neighbors across Washington state. Our legal team has actively intervened in 18 cases of suspected elder exploitation, preventing predatory family members from abusing emergency temporary guardianships to seize control of estates. One case in particular stood out. Our foundation's lawyers had represented a 75-year-old retired shipyard worker named Robert, who had spent 40 years working the docks in Tacoma. His greedy daughter and her husband had tried to file a fraudulent medical petition to declare him incompetent, aiming to sell his simple home and seize his retirement savings. The daughter had used a corrupt local doctor to sign a falsified psychiatric affidavit, a method that was a carbon copy of Silas Thorne's playbook. The Foundation's intervention in the Tacoma Superior Court was swift and decisive. We hired independent medical experts to verify Robert's excellent cognitive health, exposed the daughter's fraud in open court, and secured a permanent protective trust for his assets. The judge was so disgusted by the daughter's actions that he referred the doctor to the medical board for suspension. Robert is back in his home, safe and secure, Gideon wrote. He wanted to pass along his deepest thanks to the founder. He said he finally feels like he can sleep at night, knowing he won't be dragged out of his own bed by strangers. I smiled, looking at the fire. That single victory made every legal battle, every dollar spent, and the painful severance of my own family worth it. Diane's name was now a shield, keeping other hard-working seniors from being dragged into the dark hold of greed. Gideon's detailed report also included a brief, highly confidential update from Gavin Sanchez regarding the current status of the key conspirators. Julian had been transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon, to serve his 36-month sentence. The former shipping manager, who had spent his career complaining about his office hours, demanding luxury perks, and looking down on our shipyard crew, was now assigned to the prison laundry facility. He spent 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, standing on a hard concrete floor in a hot, humid basement, washing and folding heavy canvas prison sheets, earning exactly $0.12 per hour. According to the reports, he had lost weight and had a vacant, defeated expression. He had no visitors, and his phone calls were restricted to a pre-approved list of contacts that did not include me, his former friends, or the Garrison family, who had completely disowned him. He was completely isolated, surrounded by the cold, mechanical routine of a federal prison. Patricia had been processed into the Federal Women's Facility in Dublin, California, to begin her 60-month sentence. The woman who had spent $18,000 of my money on a velvet sofa demanded case after case of imported wine, and treated our family like servants was now wearing standard orange prison scrubs. She was assigned to the dining hall sanitation crew, spending her days scrubbing grease from metal counters, scraping garbage into bins, and mopping floors. Her expensive manicures and designer outfits were long gone, replaced by raw, calloused hands and a faded prison uniform. Gavin's contact reported that she had already lost her high society attitude, having been disciplined twice by prison guards for violent screaming matches with other inmates, resulting in her being placed in solitary confinement for a week. Donald Garrison remained in Tacoma, working at the local car wash for tips and living in a tiny, drafty boarding house room, completely ignored by his parents. Charles and Brenda Garrison's real estate business had been forced to pay a massive IRS penalty, and their social standing in Medina was completely dead. They had closed their country club accounts, sold their luxury cars, and downsized their home just to keep their business afloat and avoid personal bankruptcy. In shipping, when a crew attempts a hijacking and fails, they are stripped of their rank and locked in the brig, while the cargo ship they tried to steal continues its voyage across the open sea. Julian and Patricia had tried to lock me away in a tiny room so they could live in luxury on my back. Now, their positions were reversed. They were the ones restricted to concrete cells and cheap institutional food, while I was living a life of absolute freedom, surrounded by the beauty of the Sound. I closed the manila folder and set it on the wooden mantel next to Diane's photograph, letting a soft sigh of relief escape my lips. The storm had passed, the channel was clear, and our legacy was finally sailing under a clean wind. The sun had completely slipped behind the majestic, snow-capped Olympic mountains in the distance, leaving a deep indigo sky studded with the first sharp, brilliant stars of the evening. The air on the wide wooden deck of my Whidbey Island cabin was cold and crisp, carrying the clean, sharp scent of salt water, wet cedar, and pine needles. I poured myself a single glass of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon and sat down in the handmade rocking chair I had placed by the railing, watching the dark, rhythmic swell of the water below. In the far distance, the faint, low horn of a departing Bainbridge Island ferry echoed across the Sound, a familiar, reassuring, and comforting sound that I had listened to for decades. In the shipping industry, a voyage is not truly complete when the vessel arrives at the harbor. It is complete when the cargo has been unloaded, the crew has been paid, the logbook has been signed, and the ship sits quietly at anchor, ready for the next tide. I looked down at the simple framed photograph of Diane that sat on the small cedar side table right beside me. The amber light from the cabin window illuminated her face. In my 71 years of life, I had made many decisions, but the choice to fight back against the people who sought to exploit her memory and destroy my life was the most important one. Sometimes the hardest part of navigation is recognizing when a line must be cut. For a long time after Diane passed, I had tried to hold on to Julian, believing that since he was my son, I had an obligation to protect him from his own failures. I had financed his lifestyle, overlooked his vanity, and allowed him to treat my wealth as a permanent buffer against the hard realities of the world. I believed I was being a good father. I remembered when Diane and I first started. We had absolutely nothing, just a small room near the docks and a shared dream. Diane would stand on the cold shipyard pier in her wool coat, waiting for my shift to end, smiling despite the freezing rain. She understood that a good life is built on respect and hard work, not on unearned luxury. But I was wrong to shield Julian. I was only enabling a decay that was slowly eating away at the core of his character. When Julian aligned with Patricia and her family, he didn't just target my wealth. He betrayed the very values of honesty, hard work, and respect that Diane and I had spent decades building. He was willing to declare his own father mentally incompetent and lock me in a memory care facility just to secure a cash payout. Patricia had tried to construct an entire life out of stolen glass and hollow vanity, and Julian was weak enough to follow her. Cutting him out of my life was not an act of anger or spite. It was a simple matter of survival, a legal extraction of a corrupted, dangerous load that threatened to sink the entire vessel. I had no regrets. Blood is a biological fact, but it is not a binding contract of loyalty. A true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared integrity, and honest care. When Julian chose to participate in that malicious conspiracy to lock me away, he formally resigned from my family, and I had simply accepted his resignation without a second thought. There was no room on my ship for a traitor. As I sat there, a massive cargo vessel emerged from the shadows of the Sound. I watched its red and green navigation lights glide smoothly across the dark water, moving with a quiet, steady power. I knew the ship's engines were running hot, the captain was on the bridge, and the crew was monitoring the gauges. For over 40 years, that busy, demanding world had been my entire life. I had lived in the daily noise of the shipyards, the tension of the corporate boardrooms, and the constant logistics of the open sea. Now, I was content to sit on the shore and watch. The Diane Barrett Foundation for Elder Justice was running exceptionally smoothly now, guided daily by Gideon Cole's steady professional hand. The $2.0 million cash endowment was entirely secure, funding the active legal defense of vulnerable senior citizens who had no one else in their lives to stand up for them or protect their hard-earned assets. Robert's heartwarming victory in the Tacoma court was just the beginning of what we planned to accomplish. We were actively patrolling the local legal channels, ensuring that predatory lawyers like Silas Thorne, corrupt doctors like Ronald Gable, and greedy, ungrateful children could no longer operate in the shadows of our legal system. Meanwhile, Julian and Patricia had years of federal prison ahead of them to reflect on the cost of their choices. They had set out to steal my legacy, believing that a 71-year-old man was easy prey. They had structured their cash withdrawals, signed their fraudulent affidavits, and booked their luxury cruise, thinking they had constructed a perfect trap. Instead, they had built their own cage, and the steel door had locked behind them. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my wine, feeling the cool evening wind on my face. The cabin behind me was warm, the fireplace crackling softly. Inside were my books, my photographs, and the quiet peace of a life lived honestly. I looked gently at Diane's photo one last time, my heart full of peace. "The voyage is complete, my love," I whispered. The shipping lanes were clear, the legal storm had passed, the cargo was safe, and the anchors were holding fast in solid ground. I leaned back in the rocking chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of the water against the shore. I was Eugene Barrett. I was 71 years old, and my life was entirely beautifully my own.